Welcome to S&C Critical Insights. I'm Marc Treviño, and together with my partner, Melissa Sawyer, I co-head Sullivan Cromwell's Corporate Governance and Activism practice. We're based at S&C's New York office.
We had an exciting development, the launch of our annual Proxy season review. It highlights what we believe were the most significant developments relating to the 2018 U.S. annual meeting season, which is just behind us.
So we're going to have lots of different points, but let's just start with sort of 2018's most notable trends. And you really can't talk about the season without talking about proposals relating to environmental, social, or political matters, or what we call ESP. Shareholders actually submitted a consistent level of ESP proposals over the past season, but there was a significant increase in the percentage withdrawn, and they were withdrawn as a result of engagement. And for the first time, the proposals withdrawn surpassed the percentage that actually went to a vote. And the driver of that, in particular, were two proposals: gender pay equity and board diversity. We even saw the ESP trend spill over into the compensation space, which is mentionable only because there really hasn't been anything going on in this space since Say on Pay. But this year, we saw a number of proposals linking or proposing to link pay to ESP performance. So looking forward, there will be more to see on ESP in 2019.
We also saw ESP proposals that related to hot-button political issues. We saw some related to gun safety at Dick's Sporting Goods and Sturm Ruger, and we saw some related to social media, fake news types of issues at Alphabet, Facebook, Twitter, Comcast, Disney, and Time Warner. The gun safety proposals were all submitted by religious organizations, and the only one that has been voted on passed with 69% of the votes cast. Of the fake news proposals, few companies obtained no action relief from the SEC to exclude them because they related to the adoption of anti-fake news policies. Others requested reports on major global content management controversies. All the fake news proposals that went to a vote received very low support, about 8.5% on average. All the buzz about ESP actually overshadowed the success of more mundane governance proposals, in particular proposals to reduce the ownership threshold that is required to call a special shareholder meeting. Those proposals almost always went to a vote, and they generally received substantial support from shareholders, with an average support of about 40%. The interesting thing is that the largest holders on those votes sided with the company. That's really the first time we've seen proposals like this get such high levels of support while still being opposed by the largest shareholders. There was also a big increase in proposals to adopt a right to act by written consent. Those received average support of about 42%. It'll be interesting to see if the popular support causes the largest institutions to shift their position on these types of proposals. We're seeing a divergence between some of the largest institutions, like passive funds, and some of the actively managed funds and smaller holders. We also continue to see a divergence between what's happening at some of the largest companies, like the Fortune 50 companies, and much smaller companies in the Russell 2000.
If you listen to any of our presentations for the prior 2 years, one thing you would have heard of by now is proxy access. But we haven't talked about it yet because it virtually disappeared from the radar for 2018. This may be because most companies receiving the proposal at this point opt to adopt the market standard. But we actually didn't see in our data or in the public data a big increase in submissions, or even a meaningful increase in submissions. Submissions were down substantially to a very limited number. This may be because we have less information regarding submitted but withdrawn proposals than usual. The New York City Comptroller was the largest proponent of proxy access over the past 2 years by a wide margin. And they haven't, and probably aren't, going to release data on submissions this year. We don't know why, but that is a big change year over year, so it makes it hard to compare. We've gone back and looked at some of the provisions for proxy access that have been adopted over the past year, and we've identified at least 9 that we believe result from the interaction between the New York City Comptroller and an issuer. There may still be more to say about proxy access if we get more data later in 2019. That being said, proposals to amend proxy access provisions to move away from the market standard have been entirely unsuccessful, so I'd be surprised if we see a lot of those coming into the next season.
One factor that gives teeth to shareholder proposals is that ISS puts out negative recommendations for directors who show a lack of responsiveness to shareholder votes on shareholder proposals. ISS continues to be the most influential U.S. proxy advisory firm, and the average support of directors who've received a negative recommendation from ISS was only about 64%. We also saw an increase in the number of directors receiving those kinds of negative recommendations. It's up by almost 4 times in 2018. Non-responsiveness to a low say on pay vote was a separate basis, and that seemed to also to resonate with investors. This is obviously getting directors' attention, but even adding more fuel to that fire is that after we put out our proxy season review this year, ISS announced that it's considering having some negative recommendations follow directors from one company to another. That's not the case now, and that could really change the dynamic around proxy advisor recommendations. It will also force nominating committees to look at what directors have done at other companies where they serve on boards.
On the other hand, there are some ISS recommendations that in this season didn't really resonate with shareholders, and it's important for nominating committees to understand those too. The most common reason for an ISS negative recommendation is board independence, where ISS has a stricter standard than the securities laws do. Shareholders, however, don't appear to view a violation of ISS's own internal standard as a meaningful concern. Recommendations related to newly public companies with governance provisions that ISS doesn't like also don't seem to have a significant impact. There may be, again, 2 reasons for this. For example, the governance provisions themselves may limit the impact of the shareholder vote. For example, like if you had a dual-class stock. But also, the types of shareholders that own IPO companies may be particularly independent and focused on the company itself and not on ISS's general voting principles. If, as Melissa mentioned, ISS negative recommendations follow directors from company to company, so potentially from an IPO company to another more established company, this type of recommendation, however, could become more significant. Finally, just worth mentioning, negative recommendations on equity plans by ISS seem particularly not compelling. There was not a single equity plan vote that we saw this year that was lost so far.
So given all of this background, what should companies be thinking about for 2019? First and foremost, I think while we've talked about shareholder proposals in the context of uncontested shareholder meetings, all of these factors can be influential if there's a proxy contest or a shareholder activism situation. So addressing these issues and being prepared to discuss them with investors in the off-season is an important element of a company's investor relations strategy. Secondly, the landscape for no-action relief is changing. The changes haven't been as dramatic as some people predicted at the beginning of the 2018 proxy season, but companies should still take those changes into account and think about whether there are avenues for excluding shareholder proposals that are worth exploring in 2019. Third, board diversity continues to be an incredibly important issue. A significant number of the nation's largest investors now list board diversity, particularly gender diversity, amongst their top priorities for the companies in which they invest. The New York City Comptroller has asked companies to provide standardized annual disclosure on board diversity and may use proxy access to advance his campaign to increase diversity, independence, and climate-related expertise in the boardroom. Even at companies that have not received a request from the comptroller, there may be increased pressure to provide greater transparency on current board composition and ongoing efforts to improve diversity. In response to this environment, a lot of companies have committed to include a diverse slate or pool of candidates in board searches. In 2018, after publicity following the filing of its proxy statement, Amazon dropped its objection to a shareholder proposal for a policy requiring a diverse slate, instead opting to just adopt the policy.
That's a lot to look forward to in 2019, but there are at least a couple of other items that should be on board agendas. The first, which is very personal, is non-employee director compensation. Late last year, we had a Delaware Supreme Court decision called Investors. And the Investors decision subjected almost all director compensation arrangements that have been in place to an entire fairness standard. Only if shareholders approved the specific compensation that directors received would directors be subject to the more lenient business judgment standard, which is not to say that all director compensation ultimately will be successfully challenged, but it does make it a much more lucrative business for strike suits. JP Morgan is one of the few institutions that tried to address this head on and included specific director compensation provisions in their equity plan, which went to a vote and was approved at the 90+% level. And it may be a model for other reporting issuers as they enter the season to think about whether they should adopt similar specific provisions to the JP Morgan ones, which both cover retainers, regular fees, but also provide an avenue to pay additional or unexpected fees in a way that hopefully wraps it all in business judgment. And finally, just a word about meetings themselves. There was a time when an average annual meeting involved a number of ordinary shareholders that were represented. It was one of the only ways that a shareholder could interact with a management team or directors, but that has changed. In the ordinary meeting today, there's very low shareholder turnout. It tends to be very perfunctory, but it continues to be a very expensive process. I think for that reason, we have seen a number of issuers trend towards virtual-only meetings. And there are shareholder groups who worry about whether those meetings will provide the same level of access as an in-person meeting does. I would say that most shareholders don't use whatever level of access that is, and that providing virtual access may actually be more balanced as opposed to the current process. It'll be cheaper, and the timing might be right for that. And so issuers may want to look to see what their peers are doing in this area as the season begins.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about our corporate governance and activism practice and to download our 2018 Proxy Season Review, please visit us on the web at www.sulcrom.com.